Ernest from the Annenberg School, and Rahul Tongia from Carnegie Mellon will present their paper, and then we'll follow with the discussion, and then we'll go into the second paper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Nash and Peter for inviting us to participate in this very exciting conference. We're going to do sort of a tag team match with this, so both of us will be presenting. And what I will do is start off with some introductory remarks that will frame and contextualize the work that we're doing, give you a sense of where we're coming from. And then Rahul will present the core model, conceptualizing network exclusion the way we have formulated, or what we refer to sometimes as the other side of Metcalfe's law, or the dark side of Metcalfe's law. And then I want to come back at the end and pose a broad question. It's sort of sociology of knowledge. What we have found, just to sort of give you a hint of where we're going with this, is that a great deal of the literature on networks tends to be of the Metcalfe law variety and concentrates greatly on network inclusion to the cost of exclusion. So an interesting question is, why should that be the case? Why is exclusion excluded from so much of the work on technology? Let me start off context and origins. And one could argue that at the heart of network theories, either implicitly or explicitly, is the issue of who benefits, whether described as the consequence of purposeful choices made by self-aware independent agents, or the more automatic interactions of digital technologies and human activities. These are fundamental assumptions about the distribution and utility of network membership. This paper and the research that it addresses and draws from tries to address the issue of inclusion by pairing it with the issue of exclusion. We've been working on this. I think we initially gave it at the TPRC presentation 115 years ago, it seems like. And we've been working on it subsequently. And so we really do welcome comments, especially from a group as heterogeneous as this one. Bottom line is that we try to include exclusion in our work. What we're hoping for someday is what might be called a grand unified theory of network inclusion and exclusion that would treat each of these equally rather than primarily looking at one side or the other. The leading example of the attention to network benefits is Metcalfe's law, which I think most people in this room understand, which states that the value of a network is equivalent to the square of the number of the nodes in the network. And Rahul will be addressing this in some detail. Just a word about the origins of this study. It really grew initially from field work conducted in China, Brazil, India, and several African countries. We then turned to the literature on the digital divide to try to help us understand what we were seeing in these contexts. And we found that it was pretty unsatisfactory. It was heavily descriptive. It was insufficiently aware of the multidimensionality of exclusion, which is a term that's come up several times in today's discussion. And there are other problems, I won't go into it, but for those of you who know that literature, you know what the limitations are. So we then turned to network theory as a way to try to understand this, because we did find a lack of rigor and theoretical robustness in the literature on the digital divide. And that's really what led us to look at these other approaches. But we found that Metcalfe's law and others that we will discuss had complementary problems. They were more rigorous, but they were still deeply flawed. They too lacked the issue of multidimensionality. They also had an insufficient awareness that individuals could pursue their self-interest through multiple networks and not simply through one single network. There was also, we found, a confusion of calculating individual and social costs and benefits. and et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into too much detail on that. So we figured that as we looked at various theories of network inclusion and exclusion, they would tell us something about the future relationship of those two terms. Would we find convergence, or does the theory or concept predict convergence between the included and excluded? Do they predict a worsening of the divide between those included or excluded? Or would they predict that the current exclusionary relationship would persist through time without getting better or without worsening? So with that, let me ask my colleague to come to the podium, and then I'm going to return a bit later and ask some impossible questions, provocative questions. Yes, the switching of the switch. This is in honor of my colleague.
Is this, so I'm Rahul Tongia. I'm not a network scientist. My bio brief, I apologize, is rather short there. It's probably my fault. I'm on leave from Carnegie Mellon, and I'm in India at a nonprofit research center called CSTEP, Center for Science, Technology, and Policy. So offline, if anyone's interested in India and development and these things, that's a separate parallel discussion. But as Ernie mentioned, this work that I'm going to share is in some ways very simple, but it's so simple that the microphone falls down. Yes. But at the same time, it really asks a lot of fundamental questions on how we think of networks, individuals, value, disparity, inclusion, exclusion. And so, F5, yes. The overview is really to start with a little bit of literature and current frameworks of inclusion in networks. And we use the digital divide as just one lens to look at networks, but it applies to all sorts of networks, both technological, non-technological, social, infrastructural. And look at, identify some limitations, which once you think about them are pretty trivial, but at the same time they have implications that have not been expounded in literature. We then present our alternative framing of disparity based on exclusion, and then we get to the gray areas, which is multiple networks and non-binary states, which is in many ways complementary to what we heard this morning, and then talk a little bit about cost to society, not just individuals, and then Ernie will come back to some more discussion on the theoretical, empirical, and practical implications of this sort of a framing. So if we just think about a network which is growing in value, because as more and more people join a network, it increases in value. So over time, we have a particular type of network, and it's growing in value. And now we start with people who are excluded from the network. They have a lower value at a given point in time, and they start later on. That's just one case of exclusion becoming inclusion later on in time. So if the growth rate of the excluded network, it could either be higher, the same growth rate, or a lower growth rate. The easiest case intellectually is to say, well, if the excluded, due to fundamental power structures or just the transferences of power, grow at a lower rate than the included, the gap is just going to grow worse and worse over time. Now, on the other hand, if we say that the further behind can leapfrog or catch up faster, like the arguments made towards mobiles in Africa, that the growth rates there are much higher than in other countries, then you expect at some point, hopefully, think that they'll converge, there'll be a catching up. What's interesting is if the growth rate of the excluded network is identical at a rate level, percentage, the absolute gap actually increases over time. This is just one of the natures of sort of exponential growth. And so that becomes an empirical question, which of these cases is actually applying. So this is just one of the drivers for some of this work, that are people catching up. Yeah.
So can you just clarify quickly, when you say the network is growing, what exactly do you mean by the growth of the network? Do you mean the growth of people in the largest component of the network? Do you mean the people who are eligible to have a tie, who have ties? What exactly does that mean?
So right now, we're keeping life very simple. It is direct membership in the network. It's a giant component, so to speak, in some ways. And
you're going to assume that if I am quote in the network, I
in that network. And so the simplest example of that is the phone system. Once you have a phone, whether you use it or not, it's your choice. So, you know, what's the exclusion? So just a little anecdote that I'm sure many in this room will know is if we think of Small World and Milgram's experiments leading to average number of hops being just under 6, well, that now is, you know, 6 degrees of separation. What was less well appreciated outside probably this room is the average number of less than 6 was only for the letters that made it, which was about 1/4. And so now the question became, what about the rest of them? Were they excluded? Did they just fail to make it due to some aberration or the small sample size? So if you look at what sort of things that Watts is saying, he's saying it was just an issue of a very small sample size. And so there's some unpublished work from Milgram, which Kleinfeld has shown that there was another experiment that Milgram did where the completion rates were actually closer to 5% with more hops. And so that has some implications on when we think about inclusion and exclusion. So most scholarly attention, as Ernie mentioned, is on inclusion. It's very simple to think of inclusion. You look at surveys of connectivity. Do you have a phone? Do you have an internet access? Are you a broadband user? It's a binary sort of question, and it's inclusion or not. That's a typical framing, which doesn't get into how you use it. There are very few frameworks of exclusion, and what we believe is you may need a combined view of inclusion and exclusion. Now, the definitions, of course, may be contentious. What is a cost of exclusion versus a disparity in value? Is disparity in value an actual cost? And what about when a network is available but not when you choose not to have it? So there's a cell phone coverage where you live, but you don't have a cell phone. How do you value that? So if we look at these traditional sorts of laws that define networks, physical, ICT, telecommunication sorts of networks. The earliest law was Sarnoff, which talked of broadcasting like TV, radio and TV, where they said, well, the value of the network is just proportional to the number of listeners. It's a very linear network, and the value is proportional to n. Then we had, about a decade or two ago, Metcalfe, who postulated the famous Metcalfe's law, which applies to phones. So if I have a group of nodes, and they can each make a full mesh pairwise connection between them, then the value is proportional to n squared minus n over 2, but we'll just simplify as being proportional to n squared. Then Reed and others postulated, well, in addition to full mesh, we can also have groups and communities built within the networks, so the actual value of the network is proportional to 2 to the n. And this is the famous sort of hockey stick curve that people talk about for the value of networks as they grow in terms of included or membership in the network. Odlyzko and others then pointed out that, well, gee, that doesn't quite make sense. So you're saying when AT&T grows from 50 million customers to 50 million and 1 customers, they've just increased in exponential value. That doesn't quite make sense. And so he postulated this observation. They postulated that you assume that the most valuable nodes join the network first. And so there's a diminishing value, diminishing returns as the network grows. So this translates more to sort of complex networks, n log n. And then there's some other types of laws. So these few are the ones that are most prevalent in literature, whether it's linear or full mesh or groupings and communities or n log n, which matches sort of complex networks, scale-free networks in terms of their underlying network structure. So what we find common between all of these is the total network value is increasing. As your network grows in value, the network is more and more valuable.
How do you measure the value? What's the variable on the axis, on the value axis? What are the units?
It's a utility-based sort of framing. There is no denominator of money that's directly attachable.
Interview people, or how do you?
It's completely conceptual.
It's a conceptual framing. It's used.
You can basically plug in the value that you would assume in that, but in a lot of the economic literature that we've looked at, the notion of utility is often used as a proxy, if you will, or a bundle.
The basic notion is that the more members in the network, more access to more people these members have.
Of course, but how do you quantify it? How do you quantify it to get the formula?
So the formula is just a framing that conceptualizes an abstract utility. It's not quantifiable and it's not comparable. So one phone network with 10 people may not be worth as much as another network of 10 people. But the framing says that a 10-person network is better than a 5-person network because of the more linkages that can be formed. So the first simplification that is made in these is, for now, they assume that all the links are equal. That's one of the premises of these sorts of simplified framings.
Well, I mean, to follow up on this issue, I mean, to have value, you have a utility function, actors have utility functions. Things have value to people for particular purposes. So, I mean, the question is, whose value is it? I mean, am I right now? I'm in, because I don't know this particular thing. I would guess from both the way you described how it came about and what the laws look like, that this would be the idea that it's the value to somebody who might be considering an operator who somehow owns that network, who might consider putting it up on the assumption that they can get people to pay them for the connections they get. So for instance, if you are willing to pay, say, $1 for all the connections, all the people you could reach, and everyone in the network is willing to pay $1, and I was going to consider building a phone network that would reach N people, the idea is I'd be able to get something on the order of N squared dollars out of that. Whereas if I could get people to pay for every group they could form, I could get something like 2 to the N. Is that a correct interpretation?
If you allow me, let's go into the presentation further and then come back, because all this is Metcalfe law. I mean, and Metcalfe is not here.
Right, I just want to understand what it is.
When you raise a very serious and important issue, which I more or less agree, but the presentation is not about this. It's about the reverse of Metcalfe law. That's why I think it would be important that we proceed, and then later on we enter into, even we can throw Metcalfe to the window. That's okay.
I just want to understand what the value, we can't talk about the value of exclusion unless you know what we mean by value.
After the presentation, please, you will be the first to take up. Okay?
It's a very important and good question. And so the short answer is they would like to monetize it like for advertising. So the internet hockey stick was people saying this website is worth so much because it's nonlinear eyeball growth rate or something. So that's one attempt at it, but whether it's justified or not is a longer separate discussion we'll get back at. So now one of the questions is, these are all monotonic. Even the linear network, which is Sarnoff, just says as I grow the number of people in the network, they are consumers of information in this particular case, there's a certain value of the network. So that's advertising is the model, that I have this many eyeballs looking at your TV show, therefore it's worth something that you can monetize if that's your end goal. But in all of them, there is an increasing value for all these networks. Now, what about those not in the network? Intuitively, you would have this sort of sense that says, well, gee, if the network is getting more and more valuable, you are not in the network, ergo, you are left further and further behind. So that's a very sort of simplified, simplistic sort of observation about just networks in general. However, the first question comes up, is this disparity a cost? And if so, how do we value it? So the simplest metric, which is based on an inclusion framework, takes the value of inclusion per person in the network. Now this assumes all the nodes and actors are equal, and then compares it with those that are outside. So if you don't have a phone or internet, or you're not on Facebook or whatever, let's say you're at 0 for now. And now that network is growing based on its network structure, whether it's full mesh, linear, nonlinear, etc. There's some value to that network. We can debate whether we've assigned a correct value. You know, for advertising, you want it as high as possible and so forth. But regardless, this is one metric of comparing inclusion and exclusion, which just says 0 versus the value per person. So let's look at Metcalfe's law as an example. If n is equal to 19, then the total network value is proportional to n squared, 361. That's just a simple sort of framing of a full mesh sort of pairwise node connections like a telephone. And per person, the value is just the total network value divided by the number of net members, which right now we're assuming are all equivalent for, as in Metcalfe's formulation.
Value divided by the member. I mean, isn't it a common good? It's not a divisible good.
Well, this is now just saying if I want to compare exclusion to inclusion at a per person level, I have to normalize it.
But wait, I mean, it's got pure jointness of supply, doesn't it?
Yes, so there is the fact that you cannot attribute the network value. It's a shared good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if I'm comparing what an individual is facing, I can't compare an individual against an entire network necessarily.
Can't you say that everybody gets 361?
Or one could allocate that 361 proportionately amongst all the actors. This is if you assigned a monetization equal to the value of the network.
So you're saying that when I use Google to find something, you can't do it while I'm doing it. You have to wait till I've finished? Or you can't have my, I mean, we can all have the same, we all get the same benefit no matter how many others are enjoying it as well, right?
Sure, but then this is getting to the...
Exactly, right.
We actually get more. The more enjoy it,
Oh,
shopping at
absolutely.
Amazon, the more we get.
So we'll come back to how we allocate individual versus aggregate in a bit. But the point is, in certain framings, if we talk of, for example, broadcasting, TV receivers. If I'm getting a TV show, there's a certain value associated with it because I'm choosing to subscribe to, or at least watch, spend my time watching if it's free broadcast. So the fact that 10 other people did or didn't, how does that impact me? Because a linear network like Sarnoff's law, which is just n, when I divide by the number of n, tells me the per person constant value. It's independent of the number. That's a function of the structure of the network, which is a broadcast mechanism. It's not, so there's different networks that have different structures, which then lead you to different formulations as the network grows per person. One could, and it doesn't detract from our argument, actually say, well, you don't need to divide by per person. The argument that we'll be making remains.
Yeah, I wouldn't think like actually
Yeah.
your argument. I know where you're going. It's going to be stronger.
But
Yes.
broadcasters use their formula. It's called CPM. Cost per
Will you
thousand.
please
Yeah.
hold the fire
Yeah.
so that we see the argument and then we destroy it?
But surely, so one of the sort of aha moments we had was, surely the disparity is different if only one person is outside the network versus 181. So what an inclusion network really says is, well, gee, you have some disparity, whether it's 19 or 361 remains to be seen. But if my total applicable population is only 20 versus 200, then my disparity is going to be very different. And that's something that an inclusion-based framing completely misses. So there, my exclusion is one person is outside the network. You're the last person on Earth or in your neighborhood or whatever who doesn't have this, versus most people don't have it. And those are two very different states of society. So there's other limitations of the exclusion framing. One is, because of the monotonic and the nature of these networks increasing in value, society overall is always better off for a growth of the network. So as you go from 10% to 50% to 90% to 99% penetration of a technology or a network good, then society is always better off. However, the loss of value at the individual level, what we posit, is getting worse and worse, disproportionately so. And so that's what we want to show. So first question is it just an example of network effects? So network effects are well known. They've been in many domains, industry standards. So is network exclusion simply an issue of competing options, like Betamax versus VHS? One network grows, the other one diminishes in value because of network effects. Therefore, what's the big deal? So if we take a hypothetical case and just say we only know about network effects right now. So I have two networks equal size, A and B, and one of them grows at the expense of the other. So now assuming it's a Metcalfe world, it's a full mesh, so my value, total value, is 25 and 25, and it becomes 36 and 16. So now my share of nodes is 6 to 4, but my share of value now goes to 70-30. This is just simple sort of network effects. But now, that can be incomplete. First reason is there can be a network superiority due to intrinsic effects. One is things like broadband being superior to dial-up, if you're comparing immunized versus non-immunized. The dynamics of networks is also lost or not completely captured just by saying network effects, because it's not only the fact that one network is 66 and the other is 4, but that it's a trend going from 5.5 to 6.4. So it's the dynamic signaling which actually indicates how a lot of markets may behave. So for example, housing values and those markets, it doesn't really matter if it's $1 million home or a $100,000 home, but do you expect it to be growing up or down in value? The next question is, what happens to the other network? In this previous example, we actually had two different networks. So one diminished in value, the other increased in value. So you saw network effects on both the growing value and the diminishing value. At the extreme example, you can say, well, the other excluded isn't even a network. They just have a 0 value. So if we take 3 different cases where we say network A is the superior network, and network B, maybe it has 0 value, maybe it is a network of diminishing value. That was the example we just saw, 5,5 going to 6,4. Or maybe network B has structural changes and dynamics that cause disproportionately decreasing value. And so what happens when the network changes, let's say one grows, the other one in the first case still remains 0. It was 0, it still remains 0. So what is the disparity? That's just relative to A. But in the second case, where you had network effects applying to the second network, then the absolute loss of value is also because of a fall in the intrinsic network value. And the third case is now you have intrinsic loss of value plus loss due to network dynamics. So if you think of another way of looking at what the costs may be of losing a node. In the full mesh example, it was very easy. You lose one node, it went in a certain way as per Metcalfe's law. But now, let's say I have something that's more like a scale-free network, close to a power law. So if I lose that central node, the value on this sort of a network will be very different than if I lost an edge node. So if we just use Metcalfe's law sorts of framings to value the networks, we may understate the impacts of exclusion. And ultimately, it is the individuals that we may care about as well. So the existing formulations that are there in literature really says, well, what is my disparity or cost of exclusion? It's my total network value divided by the members in the network. We'll get to your question later. Or what we're proposing is, once you're dealing with exclusion for the individuals who are excluded, then it's the network value as per any law divided by the members outside the network. So now exclusion is shared by less and less people as the network grows to become the dominant or majority network. So it's a very simple sort of framing. And we applied it to Metcalfe's law, Sarnoff's, Reed, all of these laws. So this is the total value of the network, the red line. And you can see that it's growing nonlinearly. If I use an included person value, Metcalfe's law is n squared. Dividing by n just leaves you with n. So the value on an inclusion basis is this green line at the bottom, which is linearly growing. Not very exciting. If we go to an exclusion framing, we actually find that the disparity starts lower, but at a certain point, actually in this case right in the middle at a size of 10 out of a total universe of 20, we find that it begins to look exponential. So if you fit this to an exponential, you get a very high r squared sort of value. And what was counterintuitive was a fit to an exponential disparity of exclusion was very high regardless of underlying network structure. This was something we hadn't expected. This is it for a linear broadcast world, where the inclusion framework here is actually constant because it's just n divided by n.
Just clarification, I'm not sure I understand. So a network of size 2, that has 2 people in it and there's no one excluded.
There's 18 excluded because now I'm assuming a constant applicable population or universe. So there's 20 people in this hypothetical universe.
Okay, so you have all 20 in.
Yes, there's no disparity.
And there's no exclusion, it goes to infinity?
No,
The thing, right?
there's a discontinuity. It goes away.
Can you just put up the last slide? Because
Sure.
It went by too fast.
Sure.
See, the one with the formula for, so the denominator is the members outside the network.
As long as small n does not equal capital N, because that's the singularity point. Yes, as long as small n doesn't.
It's a comparative notion, right? So as soon as you don't have 2 networks, you can't use a comparative.
You can't. You're dividing by 0 at that point.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah.
You say why? I must have completely blanked out. Why are you fitting regression into this? I mean, you know those laws, right?
Yeah.
They're deterministic. You have them in hand.
Yes.
So you can get this in closed form, right?
You can, but
Why are you fitting
we're
regression. I mean, there's nothing uncertain here. There's no data.
no. There's no data except we're now fitting it to something that is not closed form accurate. We're applying it to it with an exponential. It's not exponential, so we're just seeing.
Why do you know the exact answer? Why did you want to get an exponential version? Is that clear?
That's just for discussion to show that it's non-linear. regardless of underlying network structure, that they all behave almost exponentially. We'll get to that in a bit. So what was counterintuitive was that regardless of the type of network, whether it was a Sarnoff type of linear network, which is just increasing in value linearly, once you go to less and less people excluded, now that disparity is distributed amongst less and less people, and it really starts to look exponential. And that's the same for Odlyzko and log n, or Reed's law, 2 to the n. And so this was sort of counterintuitive. So now this is looking at exclusion once there are less and less people excluded. Now the flip side is also the earlier part of the network when you only have 1, 2, 5, fewer number of people in the network. Network inclusion value framings themselves may fail to capture the importance of new laws. This is captured by issues of first mover advantage, positive feedback, people who are able to set up the rules of the game, or they can capture a disproportionate portion of growth. So if I think of a developing country which has 5% broadband penetration, for example. If you say, well, they're just a small percentage of the population, it's meaningless. No, these are nodes of highly disproportionate importance based on who they are. So what we're proposing is, and we don't make any claim that we're there yet, is what we really may need is a grand unified theory of inclusion and exclusion, which has a transition maybe at a certain point to be determined based on the network characteristics. Because some of the literature says that in an initial period, network membership offers a competitive advantage. But at the same time, once it becomes the norm, it becomes a competitive necessity, and so not having it is really what hurts. So this is literature in the IT sort of domain. So the difference in framing, I haven't normalized, you're absolutely right, you can do a closed form when you normalize because you know the answer, is greatest when only a few people are excluded. So now as we look at new media, broadband is now 60% of US households. Now you're talking about crossing that tipping point or that phase transformation where now you're worrying about exclusion with less and less people being excluded. So ultimately we may need a grand unified theory. So applying new parameters to our model to existing laws of networks shows exponential costs to the excluded. And what was interesting to us was this was regardless of underlying network structure. So our proposed model for exclusion can capture, we believe that this framing captures issues of both network structure, which is there in the numerator, and the dynamics, because that's there captured by an ever diminishing or decreasing denominator in a simplified form. It's not a pure law. Maybe empirically you will need refinements such as alpha and beta, which actually look at how the numerator and the denominator need to vary to be accurate. So if I revisit exclusion now, coming back to the morning's discussion on multiple networks, exclusion is really difficult to measure. It's not binary. So cell phones per 100 is usually how a lot of surveys get done on inclusion into the telephony network. But if I can't get a form off the web, then I'm going to have different modes of interaction with nodes. So I may call, I may fax, I may write, I may travel. Now within travel, I may have to take a car if I have one, I may take the bus, I may walk. And all of these have different requirements and impacts when you talk of time, money, skills, and so forth. So if we look at a lot of statistics, they fail to capture such multimodal networks. Forget their interaction. Why didn't you do this? Well, was it because it was unavailable, unaffordable, inaccessible to me, cognitively, language? Those relationships are often not known in the studies that look at in-network inclusion. How many of you drive to work? Well, I can't carpool. There's no one else nearby who lives near me. But if we only say how many people carpool and how many people drive themselves, you will not get that sort of interaction. Another interesting sort of finding that we've attempted to dig into a little is how does this impact those outside the individual? We can hypothesize that the individual is disproportionately impacted as exclusion grows worse. What about society overall? So one of the first things we find is very often, especially for infrastructure and many other goods, healthcare, we maintain dual or parallel networks. Even if there's a quote-unquote superior network that is growing, there's a secondary network that continues. We still have pulse telephony for the grandmother in Peoria, Illinois. And it's a parallel network that we're all paying for. So now there's a transition from analog to digital TV. Older systems actually may not be maintained or patched. So this is an interesting study that showed Windows 98 machines are responsible for somewhere 78, I forget the exact number, enormously disproportionate number of internet attacks because they're not patched. So now even if I am a Vista XP or now Windows 7 user, I am hurt because of the network exclusion faced by people missing security network being up to date. So the included bear a cost for the excluded in many cases. And this happens all the time in healthcare. If we think of those lacking health insurance, end up in the emergency room, often too late, and then the costs associated with that are then distributed amongst the included. So now this has policy implications and questions when we think of universal service, when we think of public utility models, subsidies and cross-subsidies. And so there are a couple of implications and directions that we think stem out of this sort of a framing. Theoretical and conceptual. How much of this is simply membership in a network more than the details of the network distribution? So without getting into node values or the granularity of the relationships, is it just in or out? What happens if we treat exclusion as a non-binary phenomenon? Because now there's strengths of ties and relationships. What happens when we postulate not all individuals are equal? Consumers versus producers is just an easy example. Empirically, I won't go into it too much, but there's one study that's been done on insured versus private insurance, which is third-party payers, and governmental insurance, Medicare, Medi-Cal. And our framing would have hypothesized that those who lack insurance, they lack network, would be paying the most. But the study actually said the uninsured pay less than the third-party payers, and the least is paid by the governmental insurance. That's counter to what we would have said. But it turns out that the uninsured, this is actually what the hospitals receive in California at receive level. It's not what they are billed at, because the uninsured actually don't pay always. Second, it ignores transaction costs. If it goes to collection, those are 25 to 30% that go to a third party. So this is based on net what the hospitals received. So we couldn't get confirmation how much that was, but they said yes, it would probably be the case that if you're uninsured, you would pay the most. And from personal experience, if you look at a healthcare bill, you say you have a medical test done, $100. Negotiated rate, because that's what your insurance company gives you, $25. So if I'm outside that network of someone with negotiating power, I lose $75 if I'm paying list price. As I mentioned, we need to get better metrics on alternative networks. So where there are choices of a network being unavailable, unaffordable, or inaccessible, like usability. And then practically, this is something that's interesting and disturbing. In general, the framing was, well, as penetration of a technology gets higher and higher, we're better off. So as I move from 10 to 50 to 85% penetration, that's a good thing. But what we're saying is, at a societal level, it may be, but what about at the individual levels? It may be disproportionately, non-linearly worse. So maybe what we need to do is subsidize the transition to really help those, and that's being done with the, for example, digital TV coupons. Right.
Do I need this thing, or can I talk loud?
No,
I need this thing.
No,
All right, I need this thing.
You
Okay.
need to talk louder, reporter will not.
Okay. Okay. I think sort of the bottom. Well, let me get hooked up first. Okay.
Everything okay?
Want to make sure I get in the network here. Again, I sort of want to come back to the very beginning, and what astounded us in looking through the literature in a variety of fields was the lack of attention to the excluded in network. I mean, that's the major point that we want to make. And one can sort of debate the ways to address that, and I think that's what we've been trying to do. But the disproportionate attention to the included rather than the excluded was a real surprise. And so part of what this work has been over the past several years has been to try to address that in a number of different settings, both conceptually and also what's relevant for policy. So our formulation would be, our reformulation of Metcalfe's law would be something to the effect that while the value of a network to an individual is equivalent to the square of the number of members in a network, and that's sort of the basic understanding, the costs to the excluded are substantial, multiple, and not unidimensional, and growing for the universe of those who could potentially be in the network. So the more you're out of the network, as 60, 70, 80, 90% of the people are included, if you're among the 15, 10%, you're screwed. There was an interesting piece, I think it was in the New York Times, looking at a reporter parked herself outside of what used to be called a telephone booth. Some of you may have seen that. And it was an enlightening reminder that not all of us are as connected in the network as we sometimes think everybody is. And so, of course, as a society, we're much better off. But for those who are excluded, as more and more things move online, for example, jobs, healthcare, et cetera, then the costs to the excluded are multiple and growing and even exponential based on the work that we've done. So I think that's the core thing that we really want to address. But the disproportion was so great between attention to the included and the excluded that it naturally raises a question of the sociology of knowledge. Why should that be the case? Why was there so much attention to the excluded? Well, one reason might be empirical. Maybe not that many people were really excluded after all from broadband, but that seems implausible. Perhaps it's a research question. It really is difficult to collect data on the excluded. It's much easier to collect data on the included. So that might be an explanation for why these things happen. And then, but of course there are others, professional reward structures. There's the issue of homophily. Am I saying this correctly? We may tend to want to study people who are like us. If everybody we know has a college degree, has 2 cell phones, and is on most networks, then it's logical at a certain level, cognitively, to assume that everyone fits that profile. So maybe it's something that has to do with proximity of what we study to who we are. Of course, there's the paradigmatic question, which ultimately I think is what scholars would want to refer to. But there are other issues of hegemony. A very interesting slide that was put up earlier today about who is paying for so many of the studies that are being done on the benefits of certain kinds of rate. Well, one can interpret that through a variety of different paradigms. Hegemony is certainly one of the paradigms that one could employ. And so I think we wanted to sort of end on that note, sort of restating what we believe to be the core contribution of this approach, which we do think stands on its own, but could also be incorporated in actor network theory. It could be incorporated in a number of the approaches that are employed by people in this room. But we also wanted to put the sociology of knowledge question on the table, especially before a group that is as diverse and thoughtful as this one. So thank you very much, and I guess we'll accept questions. Go back to our seats.
Yeah, I enjoyed the question very much, and I think that there are a lot of interesting things to look at here. I mean, I think, but as we were starting to say before, the immediate thing that strikes me about the specific way you're approaching this is that, as far as I can tell, these notions of value are models for operator value. I mean, again, if I was going to construct this network and I were going to be able to somehow charge money for it, how much could I get for it? So it's a kind of total network value. But your question is at the individual's user level value. And so some of these things, just sort of dividing by n is not going to give you what you want. So I'm not actually sure that I buy the specific results in that regard. And I also think that, given that you actually have models that give you closed form, to sort of throw it away by trying to fit an exponential to it doesn't make much sense, especially because then you're claiming these things are exponential, but of course most of them are not exponential. The fact that you can kind of approximate them by an exponential doesn't mean they are exponential. In fact, you know what they are. Most of them are polynomic. So if you know they're polynomic, you should say they're polynomic, not they're exponential, because that's going to lead to a lot of...
Can you say polynomic to a lawmaker?
I can say polynomic to anyone I want.
But they may not understand the word you're saying.
Oh, that's right. That's a separate problem. Well, I can tell you, if I'm talking to a lawmaker, they're not going to understand exponential either. You can say more, and you can say you're not going to get reelected. and you might get that.
Try say accelerating, decelerating.
Yeah, I mean, you could get that, but I think that point you could make, but I mean, you know, it's just, but if you're going to say it, you might as well say the thing you know, because often we're in a world, I mean, I stress it, because we're often in a world where we don't know what the functional forms are, and we have to. So, my gosh, you're in a world where at least you know what it is, so don't throw it away. I mean, anyway.
So if I can respond to these excellent questions. The second one is a little easier. Part of the reason for choosing exponential is that it actually is something that's a little more accessible. And the second point is that the closed form is actually knowable because we're starting with assumptions of network structure and network formulation. But we can't and don't want to make any claim that that is the right formulation. Which network?
But you are when you go out there and you make the story. I mean, you are
we're using
assuming.
any of them. Our point is, regardless of which one we chose, we looked at linear all the way to 2 to the n, which is exponential underlined. That is, yeah, Reed's law is exponential.
Yeah.
When we looked at all of them from very slow to very high monotonic increasing value, it approximates exponential. So it's accelerating at a very, very high rate is the storyline that comes out.
But it approximates quadratic. It approximates anything that curves up like that.
Yes,
I mean,
yeah. But the point is that approximation holds good regardless of underlying network structure, which was something surprising.
Let me make an intervention, if I may, is that the question of whether you're right on the quadratics or we're right, it seems to me is less important than drawing the attention of scholars to something that had not been examined carefully before within a particular framework.
Well,
let me just finish. If you go through the Journal of Economic Literature, the American Economics Review, telecoms policy, you tend not to find the argument, you tend to find an argument about network inclusion. Full stop. Our belief is that 2 billion people in the world are included in some of the dominant technology networks, and 4 billion are excluded. It seems to me that's an important empirical starting point. Now, whether or not your estimation is closer or our estimation is closer.
I'm talking about your estimation. It's not my estimation. I'm reporting on what you put on your slides.
Well, but you suggested that there are other formulas, and we're perfectly okay with that.
No, like I said, you can get a closed form which is not exponential, and we know
This
that.
is from yours. This isn't my equation. This is your equation.
Yeah, no,
I'm just
so
telling
we're
you what
just
your own
showing.
equations say.
Our only,
Yeah.
So this may just be a question of clarification because I'm not sure I've got this right. But it sounds, if I'm understanding the precise framing correctly, the question is, what is the marginal impact of including each additional formally excluded person from the network? Is that fair? What's the marginal impact of including each additional excluded person until everybody's in?
it's not set up at a marginal level. It's at an average level. Because, I mean, to answer marginal, one would actually have to
to get the idea of accelerating, so accelerating says the marginal impact is increasing.
Well,
So that the most valuable excluded person to include is the very last one, because the last one takes us to infinite value, if I'm understanding this correctly. Whereas the first one that you bring in doesn't really do much. And if I'm understanding it correctly, and that's what you're saying, that doesn't seem to apply to some of the examples, such as the Windows XP. So I think we would not pay very much to collect the first Windows XP machine to get it out of circulation. We wouldn't pay very much to collect the last one either. It's some kind of non-monotonic function.
So you're absolutely, you're raising the important issue that none of the frameworks that were shown from Sarnoff to Reed are actually representative of the real world, because they all make the assumption that all the nodes are equivalent. So that's not necessarily the case in the real world. If I had to target which machines to take out, I wouldn't care if it was Windows XP or 98 or whatever. I would care that it was an unpatched, unsecure type of machine, because it's a smaller number that are actually doing the damage. They happen to fit that mold of being in that type of a unsecured network. So not all nodes are the same in a lot of these networks. Jonathan?
I was on the California Broadband Commission for the governor. Ernie, I want to direct this towards you. the idea of universal broadband, i.e. some kind of very subsidized rate for poor people, was always poo-pooed by certainly the network operators and a lot of other people, that wasn't a good use of public money. Would your formula argue that that is in fact the great use of public money, that getting the last person into the network is more important than other uses of public money to, say, make networks faster or something like that?
Well, I think whatever the specific answer to that question, the broad purpose of the framework is that when addressing the members of the Federal Communications Commission, as I have done, as Rahul has been also invited to do, or healthcare, issues of healthcare, that it is essential to pay attention to the excluded. In other words, the debate easily resolves into talking about the benefits to the included and not the excluded. So in some ways, we're somewhat agnostic over the use of the formula. But part of what we're trying to do is to debunk the current existing formula about network inclusion. Well, for example, I don't think we would argue that the last person included and the first person included would be equal in value. I mean, that's one of the interpretations that we put up, but that wouldn't be our. So I think, Jonathan, to answer your question directly, it would be that would be one of the things that would go into a consideration of what should be done with the marginal money. But within that system, if you look at healthcare, should it go to defense? Should it go to healthcare? Should it go to transportation? We can't really answer that within this formulation. We probably have more to say if you're looking within a single network, healthcare network, broadband telecommunications network, etc. But intermodal, it would be hard to.
I mean, so if I could just follow just briefly. It is a trade-off that do I want to give the existing included faster broadband, or do I want to give a minimum broadband to everyone? Yeah. And the work really, we hope, forces people to ask that question so they can make an explicit trade-off instead of just letting the excluded not participate, because by definition they're excluded. Oh, you're not a customer? Then you're not part of my surveys. You're not in my mode of thinking.
Nor do they have political voice. This is where I think it intersects with the power question. That the excluded not only cannot consume, arguably, but they also cannot produce. They cannot tell their stories, and they can organize politically less effective to exert the kind of power that Manuel Castells talks about in his latest book, if you're not a member of that, even the alternative network.
Yeah, because most of the public funds are going towards giving the existing network faster speeds rather than spreading, getting more people into a network.
So we want to raise that question. The second thing that isn't thought through enough is sometimes there are hidden costs through multi-net networks that haven't been studied enough. So let's say, for example, we're dealing with banks or companies that say, I'm going to charge you money to talk to a human, so instead you should use the internet to transact or do transactions. Well, at some point there's pushback and you have to maintain the parallel networks. You can't get rid of bank tellers, forcing people to use ATMs or more than ATMs, internet transactions only. So there are costs that then blow back to the entire society, and they're probably the most pronounced in healthcare.
Mine is a question that is maybe a more definitional issue. I'm thinking about, use the word networks in the context of this presentation. Am I correct that when you define a network, everyone in the network is either completely connected or none of the people are connected at all?
Yeah, I mean, in these chosen network formulations, they're all equivalent nodes in a connected network.
In a completely connected
in a completely connected network.
So that means, and I was thinking of that in the context of the health example, when you showed that there was the uninsured. So the reason that the uninsured was quote unquote a network in this sense, the analogy that you're making.
So that was a question, that are they zero network or are they a secondary network that we make, are they really a network?
Right. So then the question then is, if that is indeed the case, how would you extend the notion of exclusion to a context where the network is not completely connected or completely disconnected. That is, even in the completely connected network, it's still possible that people are still quote-unquote excluded because they may have a phone and the ability to call everyone else, but that doesn't mean they have the capital to call everyone else.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah,
Excellent.
absolutely. I mean, that's another layer of, yeah.
You haven't really considered that.
David, you?
So I thought this was great, and I want to say something in support of the general project. I had a very meager contribution to the work on network power, where I actually do try and do the same sort of thing, which suggests that exclusion from networks is an important form of power in the network society. So I'm very on board with all of this. I had three thoughts about where this might go to pull in people like me who don't care so much whether we call it polynomial or exponential, but are very concerned about the political theoretic backdrop, which I think you, as you said, David, Wilson speaks to very squarely. The first is that this is a fairly general phenomenon that goes way back. Adam Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments talks about how a kid who was shoeless in Scotland didn't feel a sense of social shame, whereas a kid who was shoeless in southern England, which of course had much higher growth rates, couldn't go out and hold his head high. So in the work on development and inequality that goes all the way back to the very beginnings of classical political economy, and still today you find there's a real cost to growth, and it's not just in terms of, say, the capabilities of networks bring us, but things like food costs. You're from Bangalore, right? I mean, the fact that the purchasing power of a certain in-group that have purchasing capacities now can create a shift in, for example, what people eat. That means that the price of grain for the very poor goes up. Are they better or worse? Are the poor in India better or worse after 10 years of neoliberal-led growth? It's a very hard question. The worst off. Now, I'm not saying that the median person hasn't gotten better, but the people who are left out of that process may be substantially worse. And that also is in some ways a network phenomenon. It's often about shared norms. It's about recognition and social life, whether you can go out and have conversations with people and not feel like you're excluded from ordinary regard, right? So this is what you're onto here, I think, is a very important general phenomenon.
And it's market fundamentalism, which actually gets back to the power structures and participation, because the mechanism that's identified, like in India with this neoliberal economics, is market participation as opposed to other forms of participation.
For citizen rights to food and so on.
You've got a couple.
I said two quick things. I don't want to take up too much time, but the other thing is that in thinking about whether you make trade-offs, for example, to increase the power of a network for the given in-group versus trying to bring outsiders into the in-group, there's some work on entitlements and baselines of who should be entitled to what and why in normative political theory that might be of interest. It's in terms of property theory and who should bear costs of different kinds of changes. There's a little bit of work there that might be interesting. Finally, this creates a nice general critique of, I think, the growth defense of inequality, the idea that we should permit high levels of social and economic inequality because first movers subsidize the goodies for the rest of us, which is the usual kind of Hayekian defense of bare bones capitalism, right? That somehow the rich, by getting their private planes, are making possible a world where down the road I too can have my private planes because they'll be subsidizing the scales, the economies of scale and scope will be, I'll eventually be the beneficiary, allegedly in the story. But your story exactly brings out what happens to me in the meanwhile when I'm in a coach class that's worse and worse and worse, and the super elite are flying in their private plane. To take a very crude example. So anyway, this is very interesting stuff. So thank you.
My comment also goes in this direction. It seems to me that the most harmful effect of exclusion do not come from the fact that somebody is not part of the network. They come from the effect that alternative technologies are progressively eliminated. In the old days, if I didn't have a cell phone, I could just go to the next corner and use a public phone. Well, today there are no more public phones. Or if I could download a form, I could go to the post office and get the form there. And again, that gets more difficult. So maybe from a societal point of view, at least from a sort of European perspective, you would say that society should provide a lifeline of essential technologies, and we could even do it in such a way that the enormous profits of the cell phone companies could get a very small tax so that the public phones would be free. That would be very difficult, very easy to arrange, and it wouldn't, you know, impact on the profits of cell phone companies at all.
Not only free, that they exist.
Yeah, first of all, no, that's what I said. There should be a lifeline, a minimum of existing forms and so on, and they should be free, and they could be very easily free.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, I mean, I think in principle, I agree with others have said, it's important to think about the issue of the number excluded, but I worry about generalizing across networks in that, I mean, certainly Metcalf isn't good. It's really about telecommunication networks and only telecommunication networks, but it wouldn't apply to lots of other kinds of networks where you could have all kinds of crowding effects and whatnot that would be very different from that law. And I would think that would be the case here for exclusion, that although there are certain kinds of networks where exclusion is going to be extremely important to look at, there might be others where the effects of exclusion are quite different. So, for example, terrorist networks, I don't think that the value to the terrorists of the terrorist network necessarily depends on the number who are excluded from the network.
Sure, and healthcare has negative value. Like, you want to be away from a virus network. And
so I think it's just empirical. Whether it's an empirical question whether whether you need to look at the effects of the excluded. Right. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. You can't. One has to be careful not to generalize.
Woody?
Oh, it's a tiny point. I'll try to make it larger because it was just a response to the public phones. But we've changed dramatically in terms of what sort of society we think we live in a kind of exclusion. Back in the Carter administration in the 1970s, I worked for the FTC on antitrust issues, and we thought seriously about cable TV stamps. And the idea was that this would be something you would give to the population who couldn't afford cable TV to help make them citizens. It was seriously considered. And now it's laughable almost, that you raise something like that. People just look at you. So this sort of neoliberal slant that goes with this is really strong.
Peter?
Well, I was just going to follow up on the point that Nash made, because we've been talking about it here. There's some research by Leskovich and Kleinberg on densification, where densification is the increase in density of a network over time. And they studied 5 or 6 different kinds of communication networks. Some were citation networks, some were email networks, and the empirical results of those showed that even the ones that were most highly connected, that is, the density increased to a stable period over time, had an exponent of 1.45, I think, something like that, for co-citation networks. And for things like email networks, the value is down around 1.11, 1.13, very, very small. So what that suggests is that the kind of ideal network that you're using here with everybody connected isn't a very good model. It's a good place to start, but you really should look at what the empirical evidence says about that, and perhaps build that into your assessment of what could potentially happen in the network.
Another somewhat different issue. I mean, we've been sort of tacitly assuming, I think, throughout the people who are excluded. I mean, first of all, they're excluded, they're not just non-participating. And then second of all, that the people who are excluded will be those with no resources. And in many circumstances, that's a reasonable assumption. But if we're thinking about things like technology, particularly things that are changing rapidly, I'm not sure that's always going to be the case. So for instance, another reason why you might wind up not participating is a competency trap. So if you think people who are currently doing very well, who are at the top of the system, right, you probably know a lot of people who, in fact, you may still know some people who don't really use email. They have a secretary, they still have a secretary, and then the secretary handle their email, okay, or they don't have other kinds of accounts on services. Why do they not have them? Well, one reason is because they're already doing very well with the mechanisms that they use, so they're very slow to adopt new things because they're switching costs. And so the people who are going to be, in some cases, the last to adopt the new wave of technology, the new way of interacting, well, in that sense, joining the network as you're using the term, may be people who, in fact, were doing very well under the old system, and they may be the ones who are actually enduring. So the exclusion cost might be realized by actually an upheaval of who's currently elite, to come back to our earlier conversation, when they suddenly get overtaken by a new generation of people who leverage the new tools in order to sort of unseat them. But if you knew that was the case, would you be equally upset about it? Would be, I guess, a sort of meta question. And anyway, just very least, it seems like you might want to also, in addition to contextualizing other things, contextualize that aspect of what you're looking at as well.
I mean, like we said, we didn't get into the issue of why you're not on a network. Was it availability, affordability, accessibility, the cognitive and usability, switching costs, I mean, or complementary network effects, which is well identified. So if I've invested in Nikon versus Canon, if I bought all the lenses for one sort of camera, then I'm going to get a camera that's compatible with these switching costs.
Well, the point of I think, again, the origins were less in high-tech stuff and more in digital divide in Sudan. And so,
or the U.S.
Or the U.S., Appalachia, et cetera. But I think your point's well taken, that it would be important in the next iteration of this to specify, because otherwise there's the risk of sort of trivializing the work and sort of saying, well, you know, so my mother-in-law doesn't use the internet. Okay, well that's, and she, for switching cost reasons.
Well, it might be interesting because it might also imply that you could get the same phenomenon. It's just sort of another way to think about what you're studying and what the effects might be. That it also comes back to the whole question, which is an old question of how you have turnover among elites and social orders. And one of the ways it comes about is you have new technologies come in that form new power bases. The existing folks may be slow, who are in charge, are slow to jump onto that bandwagon because they already do well with the existing structures, and they don't realize until it's too late. And if we go back to your nonlinear problem of nonlinear growth of relative costs, insofar as that's true, we know people are not very good at nonlinear extrapolation. So they may overestimate how much time they have to switch before they get knocked down by their competitors. So I mean, you could argue, I mean, it's not my specialty, people in the tech industry, this has happened a lot to unseat firms, for instance, from their dominant positions. So if you can explain that as well with that point of view, it might give another way to think about things.
One small remark on my own. For me, the extraordinary interest of your contribution and the approach that you have been developing over recent years is the focus on exclusion rather than on inclusion, and trying to conceptualize, define empirically, and that's the critical thing, more than the ways to calculate or to formalize. Yeah. Because in terms of the actual use of your concept, and rather than concept, I would say perspective of research, in empirical research, then you will have to start differentiating networks in terms of participants in the networks and in terms of the technologies. Because, for instance, if we say internet, then, and you say planet, then it's 1.5 billion. But if we say wireless communication, it's 4.7 billion connected of subscribers, not of people, subscribers. Which, yes, you take out Swedish professionals with 5 phones, but you add plenty of villages in Africa and Latin America with one, they get the whole. So, and therefore you have to specify connections. And then in terms of also the reasons for, you will have to differentiate between supply and demand in networking. Because the supply, what is calculated is how much is offered by the operators. And what is not calculated either is the people who want, don't want, use, don't use. And there, the first thing is to eliminate all the dead wood of demand, meaning people over 60. Because, of course, I mean, once you eliminate people over 60, which is a biological law, right? Then things clear out very quickly. Because under 30, everybody is or will be connected very soon. Then how connected, in which type of network, etc. So the whole notion of exclusion, inclusion in relationship to connection, and starting with the inclusion, has to be turned upside down by differentiating technology, differentiating people, differentiating networks, and therefore starting from exclusion as much as from inclusion. And then I think all the discussion becomes less polynomial and more to the point.
I would argue that a student deciding not to be on Facebook is a political stance.
It's a political
stance. To self-exclude themselves.
Janet?
I would say, I think also it's important to consider the cost for the included of having people excluded because they're not reachable or they're not contributing to a public good to which they need to contribute. To give you an example, we did a study of a database among law enforcement organizations across 4 different counties. And there were a couple cases where a police organization decided not to share information in the database. That it was designed to prevent conflicts, officers shooting at each other because they didn't know who was doing the stakeout where. And so they wanted everybody to contribute what they had in mind so they wouldn't stumble on each other. And if an organization had a planned action and they didn't contribute it to the database, that had implications for those people who wanted to have an action next door, and their action was going to be disrupted because somebody was going to go kick a door when they were trying to put a stake out in. I mean, it's a simple example, but I think it would be useful to think about the cost for the included, well, that some people are excluded even if it's voluntarily and even if they have their own resources.
Thank you. Any more refreshable question or comment? Then we are exactly on time. So we move then to the next presentation on inclusion and exclusions.